What if the system designed to protect you was actually built to silence you? One man, wrongfully targeted, framed by those sworn to uphold the law. But instead of backing down, he fought back. And what he uncovered, it was bigger than just one corrupt cop. This was an entire machine built on power, lies, and control. Now, the truth is out, but some people will do anything to keep it buried. How far would you go to expose the truth? Keep watching, because this is just the beginning. Michael Carter rolled down the quiet suburban street, one hand resting lazily on the steering wheel while the other tapped in rhythm with the smooth jazz playing through his car's speakers. The late-night air was crisp, the kind that carried the lingering scent of fresh rain and asphalt. It had been a good evening, dinner with old friends, a couple of laughs, and for the first time in a while, a feeling of ease. The glowing streetlights cast long shadows over the pavement as Michael turned onto his block. Familiar houses stood in quiet rows, their porch lights flickering like sentinels against the night. But as he neared his driveway, something caught his eye. A patrol car idling at the intersection, its headlights suddenly flaring to life as he passed. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a stop sign. He had done nothing wrong. Yet, that car sat there, engine humming, and for a fleeting moment, Michael could feel the weight of its gaze on him. He pulled into his driveway, turning off the ignition but keeping his hands still on the steering wheel. A quick glance in the rearview mirror confirmed his suspicion. The patrol car had moved, rolling forward at an unhurried pace, its silhouette framed against the dim glow of the street lamps. Michael exhaled slowly. He had read stories, heard the statistics, seen the viral videos. A successful black man in a nice neighborhood driving an expensive car. That was often enough. His fingers clenched briefly around the wheel before he forced them to relax. He stepped out, locking his car with a faint chirp. The air felt heavier now, the stillness of the neighborhood pressing in. He walked up the short pathway to his front door, his steps measured, his ears tuned in to the sounds behind him. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, a car door slammed shut. Inside, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The familiar warmth of his home should have been comforting. Yet a prickle of unease trailed down his spine. His fingers hovered over the light switch. Then, almost as an afterthought, he turned and double-checked the lock on the door. Then the back door. Then the windows. Paranoia? Maybe. Or maybe not. By the time he had changed into a worn t-shirt and sweats, exhaustion was beginning to set in. The kind that came not from work or socializing but from the mental strain of being on alert. He shook his head at himself and rubbed his temples. Then, just as he reached for the bedside lamp, a flicker of movement caught his attention. A beam of light, thin, focused, swept briefly across his living room window. Michael froze. His pulse skipped, then quickened. Stepping cautiously toward the window, he peered through the blinds. A figure moved past the edge of his yard, a dark silhouette barely distinguishable in the shadows. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Michael stood there, heart pounding in his ears. This wasn't just paranoia. Something was wrong. Michael stepped out onto his porch, blinking against the morning light. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and freshly brewed coffee from a neighbor's open window. He exhaled slowly, shaking off the lingering unease from the night before. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was nothing. As he walked to his car, he forced himself to focus on the day ahead. A morning meeting with his team. A project deadline approaching. Routine. Familiar things that had nothing to do with shadows moving outside his window. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the quiet suburban street. Traffic was light as he merged onto the highway. He kept to the speed limit, his hands steady on the wheel. The jazz station played softly in the background, a calming rhythm against the low hum of the road. Then, in the rearview mirror, a flash of red and blue. A patrol car. Michael's grip on the wheel tightened as the cruiser edged closer, its lights pulsing in the morning haze. His heartbeat picked up, a dull thud against his ribs. He signaled, changed lanes, hoping it would pass. It didn't. The siren blared. A short, commanding burst. Michael swallowed hard and pulled onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under his tires. He shifted into park, resting both hands on the wheel. Through the mirror, he watched the officer step out. Doyle. The same officer from last night. Doyle moved with slow, deliberate steps, adjusting his belt as he approached. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, assessing, lingered a little too long on Michael's face before flicking toward the car. License and registration. Michael kept his movements measured, reaching for his wallet. Can I ask why I'm being stopped? Doyle didn't answer. He just extended his hand, palm up, waiting. Michael handed over the documents. Doyle took them without looking, tucking them under his arm. Then he leaned down slightly, his gaze sweeping over the interior of the car. Step out of the vehicle. Michael's pulse spiked. Is there a problem? Doyle didn't blink. Out. Now. A cold knot tightened in Michael's stomach. He had no choice. Keeping his breathing even, he unbuckled and stepped onto the shoulder of the road. Doyle circled the car slowly, running a hand along the edge of the driver's side window, like he was searching for something. When he reached the rear, he tapped twice on the trunk. You mind popping this open? Michael hesitated. What exactly are you looking for? Doyle's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, an edge sharpening. Just routine, he said, unless there's a reason you don't want me looking. Michael clenched his jaw. He could feel it now. The unspoken accusation hovering in the air. Not a traffic stop, not a random check, a test. He opened his mouth, about to say something, but movement caught his eye. A car had pulled onto the shoulder a few yards away. A woman sat in the driver's seat, watching. A stranger, her face partially obscured by sunglasses. But there was something in her hesitation, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if debating whether to intervene. Doyle followed Michael's gaze and smirked. Relax, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping just enough that only Michael could hear. I'll let you go this time. But if I see you around again, well, let's just say I'll be taking a much closer look. He handed back the documents and took a step back, as if nothing had happened. Michael stood frozen for a moment before reaching for his papers. His fingers trembled slightly, but he willed them steady. Without another word, he turned, got back into his car, and pulled onto the road. He didn't look back, but in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. Michael tried to convince himself that it was over, that Doyle had simply been flexing his authority. Nothing more. But as the days passed, the feeling that he was being watched refused to fade. On his way to work, he noticed a patrol car parked at the same intersection near his house. Always at the same time. On 2 different nights, a cruiser drove by his street slower than usual, lingering just long enough for him to see. At first, he told himself it was a coincidence. Then, after the 3rd and 4th time, he knew better. At the office, he kept busy, focusing on his projects, but a weight sat heavy on his chest. Each time he left the building, he scanned the parking lot. Each time he stopped at a red light, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, searching for the familiar flash of headlights trailing too close. At home, he double-checked the locks on his doors before bed. Then, sometime in the night, he would wake and check them again. The feeling crept under his skin, whispering at the edges of his thoughts. This wasn't paranoia. It was a warning. The morning was bright when he stepped out of the office parking garage. The air was cool, the city alive with the hum of traffic. He took a steadying breath, telling himself he would not let fear dictate his life. Then, as he pulled onto the main road, flashing lights filled his mirrors. Not Doyle this time, a different officer. Michael pulled over, heart hammering against his ribs. A broad-shouldered officer approached, his face unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. He leaned down just slightly, the weight of his presence pressing against Michael's space. You ran that last light, the officer said flatly. Michael frowned. No, I didn't. The officer straightened, adjusting the strap of his belt. License and registration. Michael opened his glove compartment, fingers moving with careful precision. He had done nothing wrong. He needed to stay calm. Step out of the vehicle, the officer said before Michael could even hand over his documents. Michael hesitated. I'd like to know why. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he turned and gestured toward his cruiser. A second officer emerged, this one holding the leash of a German shepherd. Michael's stomach clenched. The first officer knocked twice on the roof of the car. "Just a routine check," he said. "Pop the trunk." Michael's jaw tightened. This wasn't a routine check. Still, he stepped out, his pulse drumming against his skin as the second officer directed the dog toward the rear passenger door. The dog sniffed along the edges, then barked. The officer yanked the door open and reached under the seat. A small plastic bag appeared in his hand. White powder inside. Michael felt the world tilt. The first officer turned, holding the bag up between two fingers. Well, he said, a slow smirk forming. "What do we have here?" Michael took a step back, breath coming fast. "That's not mine. That wasn't there." The officer ignored him, pulling out his cuffs. "Turn around." Michael's mind raced. This was a setup, a perfect one, and no matter what he said, they wouldn't listen. A hand yanked his arm behind his back, metal snapping tight around his wrist. As they pushed him toward the squad car, Michael turned his head. A figure stood a few yards away, watching. Doyle. He wasn't in uniform, just standing by the side of a building, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. And Michael knew. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was war. Michael sat on the hard bench, his hands resting on his knees, fingers clenched. The small holding cell smelled of antiseptic and stale sweat, the kind of scent that lingered in places meant to break people down. The fluorescent light above buzzed, casting a cold glow over the tiled floor. He had been here for hours, long enough for the initial shock to dull into something heavier, rage simmering beneath the surface, kept in check only by the stark reality of his situation. The arrest had been a setup. That much was clear, but knowing it and proving it were two different things. A public drug charge, even if dropped later, could stain everything: his job, his reputation, his entire life. A man like him, a black man in America, didn't get the luxury of mistakes, even when they weren't his to begin with. The sound of approaching footsteps made him lift his head. A uniformed officer stopped outside the cell, unlocking the door with a metallic clank. "Michael Carter?" A woman's voice. He looked up to see a figure stepping into the doorway, a woman in her 40s. Sharp-eyed, dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse. Her curly brown hair was pulled back, and she carried herself with a confidence that left no room for nonsense. "I'm Rebecca Hayes," she said, her voice steady, measured. "Your attorney." Michael blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't called a lawyer. She tilted her head slightly. "I know you're wondering why I'm here. Let's just say your situation got my attention." The officer grunted, stepping aside as Rebecca motioned for Michael to follow. They walked down the hallway, past other holding cells, the weight of the moment pressing against Michael's chest. As they reached an empty interrogation room, Rebecca pulled out a chair and gestured for him to sit. "I don't need to tell you how serious this is," she said, lowering herself into the seat across from him. "But I can tell you this. It's not the first time I've seen it happen." Michael leaned forward. "You think they planted it?" Rebecca gave him a look, one eyebrow arching. "I think Doyle and his friends have been doing this for a while. And I think you're their latest target." Her certainty sent a chill through him. She set a folder on the table and opened it. "I requested to see the evidence against you." She met his gaze. They refused. Michael felt his jaw tighten. "Because they have something to hide." "Exactly." The door swung open abruptly. "Doyle." His expression darkened when he saw Rebecca. He stepped inside, arms crossed, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like you got yourself a lawyer." Rebecca didn't flinch. "I'm here to make sure my client is treated fairly." Doyle let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You really think you can get him out of this?" Rebecca leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "He doesn't need to get out of anything. Because this entire arrest is a sham. And you know it." Doyle's smirk faded just slightly. "You don't intimidate me," Rebecca continued. "And if you think you can make this disappear, you're wrong. In fact, I think I'll be making a few calls to some reporters after I leave here." Michael watched as Doyle's posture shifted ever so slightly. It was a flicker, but it was there. A crack in his confidence. "Fine," Doyle muttered after a beat. "Let's see how far that gets you." He turned on his heel and stalked out. Silence hung between them for a moment before Rebecca exhaled. Sitting back. He's rattled, she said, which means we just made his life a lot harder. Michael studied her, the fight in her eyes, the unwavering way she had stood her ground. For the first time in hours, he felt something other than dread. Hope. Several tense hours later, an officer returned, wordlessly unlocking the cuffs from his wrists and gesturing toward the exit. No explanation, no apology, just quiet acknowledgement that they had lost this round. Outside, the night air hit his face, crisp and cool, as if the world itself was giving him a second chance. Rebecca stood beside him, arms crossed. This isn't over, she said simply. Michael took a slow breath. I know. She studied him for a moment. Are you ready to fight back? Michael didn't hesitate. Yes. Michael sat behind the wheel, gripping it tighter than necessary as he pulled into his driveway. The street was quiet, the porch lights of neighboring houses glowing softly in the dusk. It was the kind of evening that once felt ordinary. Now, nothing did. Stepping out of the car, he scanned his surroundings, an old habit he never thought he would need in his own neighborhood. The air felt heavier, laced with an edge of uncertainty. He had been released from custody. But he wasn't free, not really. Inside, he locked the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Rebecca had made it clear, Doyle wasn't finished. If they didn't act first, he would come back stronger, more prepared. His phone buzzed. Rebecca. Her voice came through sharp. No pleasantries. You need to see this. They met at a coffee shop downtown, a small place tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. Rebecca slid a tablet across the table, her expression tight. Doyle has done this before, she said. A lot. Michael scrolled through the screen, reading reports of other arrests, black men, mostly, pulled over on flimsy charges. Drugs mysteriously appearing in their cars. Most of them pled out, too afraid to fight. He looked up. This isn't just about me. Rebecca nodded. That's what I've been trying to tell you. She pulled out a manila folder, tapping the top page. There's one case that stands out. A guy named Marcus Reynolds. Arrested 2 years ago. Same pattern. He fought back but disappeared before his hearing. Michael felt something sink in his gut. Disappeared? Left town. Supposedly. She shook her head. His family hasn't heard from him since. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe humming in the background. Michael rubbed his chin. We need to find someone who'll talk. Rebecca hesitated, then reached for another sheet. There is someone. Derek Mason. He was arrested last year. Same Mo. But he got the charges dropped. He never spoke out, though. My guess? He was scared. Michael nodded. Let's find him. The plan was simple. A conversation. No pressure. Just enough to see if Derek would be willing to share his story. They found his address. An apartment complex in a rougher part of town. A place where people minded their own business. Michael knocked. No answer. Rebecca tried next. Nothing. Just as they were about to leave, a woman stepped out of the neighboring unit. A young mother balancing a toddler on her hip. She eyed them cautiously. You looking for Derek? Rebecca nodded. Yes. Do you know when he'll be back? The woman shifted her weight. Haven't seen him in 2 days. Michael exchanged a look with Rebecca. Did he say anything before he left? Michael asked carefully. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. Said he thought someone was watching him. A chill ran through Michael's spine. Rebecca kept her tone neutral. Did he mention who? The woman adjusted her child on her hip, glancing at the parking lot as if someone might be listening. Then, quietly, she said, he just kept saying one name. Michael leaned in. Doyle? She gave a tight nod. Yeah, that's the one. By the time they got back to Rebecca's office, the weight of the situation had fully settled. Michael sat on the edge of the desk, rubbing his temples. He's tying up loose ends. Rebecca stood by the window, arms crossed. And he knows we're digging. Michael let out a slow breath. What's our next move? Rebecca met his gaze. We keep going. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. As Michael pulled up to his house, something felt off. The porch light was on. But the door, his front door, was slightly open. His chest tightened. He stepped out, muscles coiled, and pushed the door wider with the back of his hand. The house was still. Nothing broken. No signs of a struggle. But something was wrong. He walked into the kitchen. On the counter sat a single sheet of paper. 5 words, scrawled in thick black ink. Know when to stop. Michael felt the weight of those words settle deep in his bones. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a promise. Michael sat at his kitchen table, his untouched cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. His phone vibrated against the wooden surface. A number from work flashing on the screen. He hesitated before answering. Michael, this is HR. A voice said, formal, detached. We've reviewed your current legal situation. And effective immediately. We're placing you on indefinite administrative leave. Michael's grip tightened around the phone. This isn't a legal situation. This is a setup. A pause. A practiced sigh. I'm sorry, but until this is resolved, we can't have this kind of attention on the company. Click. The call ended. Michael stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down. So that was it. No trial. No questions. Just immediate damage control. He had spent years building his career, proving himself. Now, with a single accusation, it was gone. Rebecca's words from the night before echoed in his mind. They weren't just coming for his freedom. They were coming for his entire life. His phone vibrated again. This time, a text from an unknown number. You should have listened. Michael exhaled slowly, forcing the anger down. He picked up the remote and turned on the news. The screen filled with his own face. Not a victim. Not an innocent man fighting back. A suspect. The segment was short, but the damage was done. An unnamed source claimed Michael had a troubled history and possible ties to drug activity. A blurred image of his arrest played on a loop, reinforcing the narrative. No mention of the lack of evidence. No mention of the planted drugs. Just a smear. Michael turned the TV off, his pulse thudding in his ears. He needed to get ahead of this. At Rebecca's office, she was already pacing when he walked in. You saw it, she said, not a question. Michael nodded. And this is just the beginning. Rebecca pulled up a website on her laptop. They're planting more than drugs. This article went up an hour ago. Michael leaned over the screen. A blog post, anonymous, filled with vague claims and leading questions. Was Michael Carter hiding a criminal past? How much did his employer really know? The language was careful. Nothing outright defamatory. Just enough to make people doubt. Michael sat back. Doyle. Rebecca nodded. It's how this works. A lie spreads faster than the truth. By the time we prove you're innocent, the damage will be done. Michael ran a hand over his face. So we don't wait. We fight back now. Rebecca studied him. How? Michael thought for a moment. Then met her gaze. We take it public before they can control the narrative. They made calls, sent emails, reached out to anyone who might listen. A name surfaced. A journalist known for exposing corruption. Someone willing to investigate when others wouldn't. They arranged a meeting. A quiet place, away from prying eyes. Michael and Rebecca arrived early, taking a corner booth in a dimly lit diner. They ordered coffee, more out of habit than necessity. Minutes passed, then an hour. The journalist never showed. Rebecca checked her phone, then looked up, her face pale. You're not going to believe this. She turned the screen toward Michael. The journalist had just been suspended from their job. Michael leaned back, his jaw tightening. Rebecca exhaled sharply. We're not just fighting a dirty cop. We're fighting the entire system. Michael sat across from Rebecca in her dimly lit office. The air thick with exhaustion and quiet frustration. The room smelled of burnt coffee and stale paper. A testament to the long hours they had been putting in. Outside, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing behind these walls. We can't go through the legal system, Rebecca said, rubbing her temples. They've locked every door before we could even knock. Michael exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the edge of the desk. So we stop knocking, he said. We start digging. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, considering. Then she reached for her phone. I might know someone who can help. The call was brief, a few clipped words, a hushed agreement to meet in person. An hour later, they sat in the back booth of a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. A man in his late 50s, wiry and weathered, slid into the seat across from them. His name tag from a security company still clung to his wrinkled uniform. You're the lawyer, he said, nodding toward Rebecca. And you. He looked at Michael. Are the guy they're trying to bury. Rebecca introduced him as Daniel Wright, a former internal affairs officer who had walked away from the department a few years ago. Daniel stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. Doyle's not just a bad cop, he said, his voice low. He's part of a unit that operates outside the lines. They plant evidence, coerce confessions, make people disappear if they don't play along. Michael felt his stomach tighten. Disappear? Daniel's expression darkened. Some end up in prison. Some just stop existing. Rebecca pulled out a notebook. Do you have proof? Daniel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and slid a flash drive across the table. This is what I managed to copy before I left. Internal reports that never made it past the chief's desk. Complaints that vanished. Officers who were protected. Michael picked up the drive, weighing it in his hand. There's more. Daniel continued. Doyle wasn't acting alone. He's just one piece of this. Rebecca's eyes sharpened. How big are we talking? Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. Let's just say if you're looking for justice, you won't find it inside a courtroom. These guys have been doing this for years. And they've got people watching their backs. Michael clenched his jaw. Then we take it outside the system. Rebecca nodded. We go to the press. They set up a meeting with a journalist, a well-respected investigator known for exposing corruption. Someone who wasn't afraid to challenge authority. The meeting was arranged for that night at a quiet bar on the west side of town. Michael and Rebecca arrived early, scanning the room for any sign of trouble. But the journalist never showed. They waited, checking their phones, exchanging tense glances. 30 minutes passed, an hour. Finally, Rebecca's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She read it aloud. Stop now unless you want another person to go missing. Michael felt the weight of the words settle over them like a thick fog. They hadn't just stumbled onto corruption. They had stepped into something far more dangerous. And now, someone was watching their every move. Michael and Rebecca sat in her car, parked in an empty lot a few blocks from City Hall. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching across the cracked pavement. We can't keep moving like this, Rebecca said, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. We're being watched. We need leverage. Michael nodded, staring out the window. Someone high enough to make them nervous. Rebecca exhaled, then reached for her phone. I know a guy. They arranged a meeting with Councilman Gerald Tate, a veteran politician who had built a reputation on police reform. He wasn't a crusader, but he had enough power to push for internal investigations. If anyone could force the department to answer questions, it was him. The meeting was set for later that night. A small cafe downtown, quiet enough for privacy but public enough to discourage threats. Michael and Rebecca arrived first, choosing a corner table with a view of the door. The place smelled of fresh espresso and burnt toast, the hum of low conversation filling the air. Tate arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a sharp suit and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He slid into the seat across from them, rubbing his hands together. You've got 15 minutes, he said, keeping his voice low. Tell me why I'm here. Rebecca leaned forward. We have proof of corruption in the police department. A network of officers planting evidence, making people disappear. Doyle is just a piece of it. Tate's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. That's a bold claim. Michael pulled out the flash drive Daniel had given them. This isn't a claim. It's fact. Tate stared at the drive, then looked at them. Do you have any idea what you're messing with? Rebecca didn't blink. That's why we're here. For a moment, Tate said nothing. Then he let out a slow breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I can't move on this, he said finally. Michael's jaw tightened. You're scared. Tate's eyes darkened. I'm realistic. There are people above me who won't let this see the light of day. You think you're exposing a few bad cops? You're exposing an entire system built to protect them. He stood up, glancing around. If you're smart, you'll drop this. Then he walked out. Rebecca watched him go, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. He's not just scared, she said quietly. He's terrified. They sat in silence, the weight of Tate's warning pressing down on them. That night, Rebecca drove home alone, the events of the day swirling in her mind. The streets were mostly empty, just the occasional headlights flashing past. Then, in her rearview mirror, she saw it. A black SUV. It kept its distance at first, But when she switched lanes, it followed. Her pulse quickened. She turned down a side street. It followed. She pressed harder on the gas, searching for an open road, a crowded intersection, anything. The SUV suddenly surged forward. She barely had time to react before it slammed into her back bumper. The force sent her car skidding. She fought the wheel, trying to regain control, but the SUV struck again. Harder this time. The tires screeched. Her car spun. The last thing she saw was a telephone pole rushing toward her. Then everything went black. Michael was in his apartment when his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, low and calm, filled the line. "You're next." Michael sat frozen, the words slicing through the silence. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was war. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the hospital room, a rhythmic reminder that Rebecca was still breathing. Bruises darkened the side of her face. A thick bandage wrapped around her forehead. Her left arm was in a cast, and an IV dripped fluids into her veins. Michael stood at her bedside, gripping the metal railing. She was awake, but barely. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy with painkillers. "You look terrible," she murmured. Michael let out a breath, more relief than amusement. "You should see the other guy." Her lips twitched into something resembling a smile, but it faded quickly. "They tried to kill me." "Michael." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I know." A long silence stretched between them. "They won't stop," she finally said. "Not until we're gone." Michael had spent the last few days watching everything slip through his fingers, his career, his reputation, his sense of safety. But standing here, looking at Rebecca lying battered and broken, something shifted inside him. They had already lost too much. He wasn't going to wait around for them to take more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Rebecca frowned. "What are you doing?" "Changing the rules," he said. Michael spent the next few hours gathering everything they had. Documents, reports, suppressed complaints, and internal records from the flash drive Daniel had given them. He created an anonymous account and began posting, piece by piece, screenshots of redacted reports, testimonies from families of those who had vanished, the undeniable pattern of cases tied to Doyle and his unit. It didn't take long for the internet to catch fire. The posts spread like wildfire, shared thousands of times within hours. Comments flooded in, people demanding answers, calling for investigations. Others shared their own stories of wrongful arrests and police intimidation. Michael watched the numbers climb, his heart pounding. Then his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He stared at it for a moment before answering. A low voice crackled through the line. "I know what you're doing. You think you can win?" Michael said nothing. A slow chuckle. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The call went dead. Michael clenched his fists. Doyle was losing control. That meant Michael was finally hitting where it hurt. But he wasn't naive. There would be consequences. Later that evening, after visiting Rebecca one last time, he stepped out of the hospital into the cold night air. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just a few scattered cars under the glow of flickering streetlights. That's when he saw them. Two uniformed officers standing near his car, watching him. One of them took a step forward. "Mr. Carter, we need you to come with us." Michael's heartbeat steadied. This was a trap. But this time, he wasn't walking in blind. Michael sat in the back of the squad car, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. The city lights blurred past the window. But something was off. They weren't headed to the downtown precinct. His pulse quickened. The car turned onto a side street, weaving through quieter roads before pulling up to a station he didn't recognize. A smaller, older building with only a few patrol cars parked out front. This wasn't procedure. The officers flanking him remained silent as they escorted him inside, their grips firm but not aggressive. A long hallway, a single metal door. They led him into a dimly lit interrogation room, the air thick with stale coffee and sweat. Michael barely had time to adjust to his surroundings before the door creaked open again. Doyle stepped inside. The smirk on his face was slow, deliberate. He pulled out a chair across from Michael and sat down, stretching his arms over the backrest like he was settling in for a long conversation. "You've been busy," Doyle said, his voice smooth, almost amused. Michael didn't answer. Doyle chuckled. "Come on, Carter. You really think this little internet stunt of yours is going to change anything? Michael met his gaze. Steady. It already has. Doyle's smirk flickered. You don't get it, do you? Doyle leaned forward, his voice dropping. I could make you disappear right now. Just like that. He snapped his fingers. And no one would ask questions. No one would care. Michael exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch. Then, he leaned forward, mirroring Doyle's posture. You think you can control this forever? He said. Look around. The story's out. People are watching. You can try to silence me. But it won't stop the truth. Doyle's jaw tightened. Michael pressed on. I sent everything to investigative journalists, civil rights attorneys, lawmakers. Even if I disappear, the information won't. It's out there, and people are paying attention. For the first time, something shifted in Doyle's expression. A flicker of uncertainty. Michael saw it, held onto it. This was never just about me. He continued. You spent years getting away with this. But now, people are connecting the dots. It's over. Doyle's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. His hands curled into fists. His breath coming harder. You don't know what you're messing with. He snapped, his voice no longer calm. Michael tilted his head. Neither do you. Doyle slammed his fist against the table, making the metal rattle. You really think you're some kind of hero? He barked. You're nothing. A footnote. You'll be forgotten. Michael didn't flinch. He had seen it now. The cracks forming in Doyle's confidence. Before Doyle could say another word, the door swung open. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, his expression unreadable. But he wasn't looking at Michael. He was looking at Doyle. You've made a mess of things, the man said, his voice low and measured. Doyle stiffened. Michael watched, realization dawning. Doyle wasn't untouchable. Even the people protecting him were starting to worry. This fight was far from over. But for the first time, Michael knew Doyle wasn't as powerful as he wanted everyone to believe. And that changed everything. Michael stepped out of the police station, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He was free, for now. But that meant nothing. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just escalated. His phone vibrated. Rebecca. He answered quickly. You okay? Her voice was tired but sharp. The same determined edge she'd had since the beginning. For now, he said, glancing around. The streets were empty, but that didn't mean he wasn't being watched. How are you? Rebecca exhaled, like I got hit by a truck. Oh, wait. Despite everything, he smiled. You need to rest. I need to make sure we stay ahead of these bastards. A pause. Michael, it's working. Have you seen the news? He hadn't, but as he sat in his car, he pulled up his phone and scrolled through the headlines. Reports questioning police misconduct. Anonymous sources exposing years of complaints swept under the rug. A news segment replaying the leaked documents Michael had posted, now picked up by major networks. They weren't just whispers anymore. People were paying attention. They're scrambling, Rebecca said, and I just got a call from someone inside the department. Michael sat up straighter. Who? Won't say their name, she replied, but they want to talk. Half an hour later, Michael pulled into a nearly empty parking garage downtown. A figure in plain clothes leaned against a pillar, arms crossed. Michael stepped out, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. You the one who called? The man nodded. He was in his late 40s, his face lined with exhaustion. I work in internal affairs, he said, and I'm sick of this department protecting people like Doyle. Michael studied him. So why are you talking to me? Because the higher-ups are panicking. He handed over a flash drive. This has records of every complaint ever filed against Doyle. Internal reports that never saw the light of day. You need to get this to someone who can't be bought. Michael took it, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Why now? The officer sighed. Because the department's already discussing cutting Doyle loose. They just need the right push. Michael nodded. The cracks were forming. At the police station, Doyle sat in a conference room, his fingers drumming against the table. Across from him, 3 high-ranking officials watched him with unreadable expressions. We've got a problem, one of them said. This mess is getting too big. Doyle scoffed. You think this is my fault? You're a liability. Another said, we can't protect you forever. For the first time, Doyle felt something cold settle in his gut. He had always been untouchable. Always had someone covering for him. But now, they were distancing themselves. They were preparing to throw him to the wolves. Michael arrived home late, exhausted but focused. As he stepped up to his front door, he noticed it immediately. The lock was broken. His stomach clenched. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The house was dark, eerily quiet. Nothing seemed out of place, until he stepped into the kitchen. On the table, a photograph. It was of him and Rebecca. A thick red X slashed across their faces. The message was clear. They weren't just being threatened anymore. They were being hunted. Michael sat in Rebecca's apartment. His laptop open, multiple tabs flashing across the screen. News articles, social media threads, comments. His name was everywhere. Some called him a hero. Others called him a liar. He didn't care about the names. He cared about the truth. Across the room, Rebecca slowly lowered herself into a chair. She was still recovering, the bruises fading but the exhaustion clear in her eyes. "You should still be in the hospital," Michael said. She waved him off. "We don't have time for that. They're losing control, and that makes them dangerous." Michael nodded. He had felt it too. Doyle wasn't just trying to silence him anymore. He was trying to destroy him. A new headline popped up on his screen. A conservative news site had published a hit piece, twisting the story into something unrecognizable. They painted Michael as an opportunist, someone staging a political attack against law enforcement. The article included manipulated images, old social media posts taken out of context. Michael exhaled sharply. "They're trying to bury this." Rebecca leaned over, reading. Classic move. Make the victim look like the villain. Michael's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're running out of time." He turned the screen toward Rebecca. "He's getting desperate," she said. "And when guys like him get desperate, they make mistakes." Then the mistake happened. Michael's inbox pinged with a new email. The subject line: "You need to see this." He opened it. A video file. A shaky recording from inside a car. The angle wasn't great, but the voices were clear. Doyle's voice. "Look, I don't care what you have to do. Plant it, twist it, make it look real. This guy needs to go down." A second voice responded, hesitant. "That's not how we do things." Doyle laughed. "That's exactly how we do things. And if you have a problem with it, you can pack your damn desk." Michael and Rebecca stared at the screen. Rebecca was the first to speak. "Where did this come from?" Michael scrolled down. No name. Just a simple note. Someone inside is tired of covering for him. He sat back. The system was cracking. Rebecca grabbed her phone. "We send this everywhere. Now." They uploaded the video to every major news outlet. Within an hour, it was trending nationwide. Anchors debated it live on air. Legal experts weighed in. Public outrage exploded. Then, Doyle vanished. For hours, there was no sign of him. His house was empty. His car was missing. But the system that had once protected him was now turning its back. That night, Michael got a final news alert. Doyle had been arrested. Not by some outside force. By his own department. Michael stared at the screen, letting the weight of it settle in. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. The press conference was packed. Cameras lined the back of the room. Reporters squeezed shoulder to shoulder. Their notepads open. Microphones poised. The air buzzed with tension. Michael sat beside Rebecca at the long table in front of them. Bright lights glaring down. His hands were steady, but his pulse pounded in his ears. They had spent weeks gathering evidence, exposing Doyle, forcing the system to acknowledge the corruption. But this was different. This was the moment they pushed the truth into the open, where no one could look away. Rebecca leaned into the microphone. "We have provided undeniable proof of police misconduct, patterns of evidence tampering, wrongful arrests, and targeted intimidation. And we know Doyle was not acting alone." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A reporter raised his hand. "Are you suggesting this goes beyond just one officer?" Michael took a breath. "We're not suggesting. We're stating it as fact." He glanced at Rebecca before continuing. Doyle was protected for years. Every attempt to hold him accountable was buried. Complaints vanished. Victims disappeared. The real question is, who was covering for him? The room erupted into noise. Questions shouted. Cameras flashing. Across the city, the protest had already begun. Hundreds of people gathered outside police headquarters, chanting for justice, their voices echoing through the streets. Some carried signs with Michael's face on them, alongside words like truth and accountability. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He had become a symbol. Rebecca pulled him aside after the press conference. "This is the most dangerous point," she said, her voice low. "Systems don't just collapse, they fight back." Michael nodded. He had no doubt. At the courthouse, Doyle sat in an orange jumpsuit, his expression unreadable as the judge read through the preliminary charges. He barely reacted, because Doyle had a plan. His lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client was not acting alone. He was following orders. If granted leniency, he is willing to provide evidence on a much larger network of corruption within the department." The courtroom stirred. Michael, watching from the back, felt his stomach tighten. Doyle wasn't just trying to save himself. He was shifting the blame, pointing to the very system that had once protected him. And that meant Michael was closer to the truth than he had realized. Later that night, as Michael sat at Rebecca's kitchen table, his phone buzzed with an alert. Breaking news. A police officer had been found dead in his home. The same officer who had secretly recorded Doyle's confession. The official report called it a suicide. Michael stared at the screen, the weight of it pressing into his chest. He knew better. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Michael sat across from Rebecca in her apartment, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The television was on but muted, the scrolling news ticker filled with updates about Doyle's trial and the growing unrest in the city. "We have two options," Rebecca said, breaking the silence. "Take the deal. Let Doyle expose the bigger players. Or refuse and force him to take the fall alone." Michael leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Either way, we're still fighting the system." Rebecca nodded. "But one of those options gives us a chance to burn it all down." The pressure outside was mounting. Public opinion was split. Some believed Doyle should be used as leverage to bring down something larger. Others saw any deal as a betrayal, letting a man like him walk with less than he deserved. Michael exhaled. "If we let him cut a deal, we're saying the system works, that it just needs some tweaking." Rebecca tilted her head. "And you don't believe that?" Michael met her gaze. "No, I think it needs to be torn apart." An hour later, they were in a conference room at a law office, facing a federal prosecutor. The man had the look of someone who had been forced into this situation. His tie slightly loosened, a stack of files in front of him. "We're willing to move forward with an official investigation," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "But it will take time. And we need cooperation. Doyle is willing to give us names." Michael didn't hesitate. "I want a full-scale federal probe into the entire department. Not just Doyle's associates. I want top-down accountability." The prosecutor blinked. "That's ambitious." Rebecca leaned forward. "And necessary." Outside, protests continued to grow. People were demanding answers, demanding resignations. Then the counterstrike came. A private meeting was arranged. But it wasn't with prosecutors or investigators. It was with city officials. Men in expensive suits with careful, measured smiles. "We're offering you a way out," one of them said, hands clasped on the table. "Walk away from this. We'll compensate you. Ensure your safety. You won't have to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life." Michael's jaw tightened. "All you have to do," another added, "is let it go." Rebecca watched him carefully, waiting. Michael didn't flinch. "No." A silence filled the room, thick and heavy. "You're making a mistake," the first man said. Michael stood. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." That night, he sat across from a television camera, preparing to go live on national television. The network had given him 5 minutes. 5 minutes to say everything. Rebecca squeezed his shoulder. "No turning back after this." Michael nodded. Then the red light on the camera blinked on. He took a breath, and he spoke. "I was told to walk away, to stay silent. But silence is what allows systems like this to thrive. I won't stop until the full truth is exposed." Somewhere in the city, Doyle watched from his holding cell. Somewhere in an office, the men in suits exchanged uneasy glances. And across the country, people listened. Rebecca sat beside him, a small smile forming. They had gone further than they ever imagined. And they weren't done yet. The morning after Michael's televised statement, the city felt different. There was an energy in the air, a tension that could tip in any direction. The headlines were everywhere. The Department of Justice had officially launched a federal investigation into the city's police force. Doyle had been indicted, charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. But Michael knew better than to celebrate. Because while Doyle was the face of this scandal, he wasn't the architect. Rebecca was waiting for him at her apartment, a laptop open in front of her, her brow furrowed. "You need to see this," she said, motioning him over. On the screen was an email from an anonymous sender. No name, no introduction. Just a single attachment labeled, "Eyes Only." Michael clicked it open. Inside was a list of names. High-ranking officers, detectives, a few politicians, people who had helped cover up cases like his. Michael felt his breath catch. "This isn't just about Doyle," Rebecca said. "This is about everyone who protected him." Michael leaned against the table, his fingers gripping the edge. "If we take this to the DOJ, they'll have no choice but to expand the investigation." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were holding settling between them. Finally, Michael exhaled. "We send it." They forwarded the file directly to the federal investigators already assigned to Doyle's case. Within hours, news outlets picked up on the leak. Some called it the biggest corruption scandal in decades. Others dismissed it as political theater. Then came the backlash. Several city officials held a press conference, denouncing the investigation as an overreach of federal power. One councilman went as far as calling Michael a pawn in a political war against law enforcement. The headlines shifted. Michael Carter, whistleblower or opportunist. Rebecca slammed her laptop shut. "They're trying to spin this." Michael ran a hand over his face. "Of course they are." But the real shock came later that night. Doyle, who had previously agreed to cooperate with federal investigators, suddenly changed his story. He refused to name anyone else. The pressure was working. The system was closing ranks. A few officers were placed on suspension, but none of the names on the leaked list faced immediate charges. The media narrative shifted again, questioning whether the DOJ had overpromised on its ability to clean house. Michael turned off the TV, frustration gnawing at him. "They're trying to make this go away." Rebecca's phone buzzed. A message. She read it, then looked up, her face pale. A secret meeting just got leaked. Michael frowned. "What meeting?" She turned the screen toward him. It was a recording, poor quality, but the voices were clear. A group of city officials and senior officers discussing how to control the damage, how to manipulate the press, how to ensure the investigation didn't go further. Michael's stomach twisted. They had made it further than they ever expected. But the fight wasn't over. Not even close. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. Doyle sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The gavel came down, echoing through the chamber like the final note of a long, brutal symphony. "Guilty." Michael exhaled slowly. The battle against Doyle was over. But the war was far from won. Rebecca nudged his arm. "It's not enough," she whispered. "He's just one piece of this." Michael nodded. Doyle's conviction was a symbolic victory. But the larger system, the one that had enabled him for years, was still standing. The officers on the leaked list were still free. The powerful men in suits who had tried to silence them were still playing their game. And Michael wasn't done fighting. Days later, he and Rebecca found themselves in Washington, standing in a congressional hearing room. The long wooden table before them felt like a battlefield of its own, lined with lawmakers, journalists, and legal experts waiting for them to speak. Cameras broadcasted the hearing live to millions. Rebecca spoke first, laying out the facts, the corruption, the patterns of abuse that stretched far beyond one city, one department. Then it was Michael's turn. A congresswoman leaned forward, her voice clear and firm. "Mr. Carter, after everything you've been through, do you believe justice has been served?" Michael hesitated, glancing at Rebecca before looking into the sea of cameras. "Justice isn't a destination," he said. "It's a fight, and it's not over." The room fell silent. Somewhere outside, protests continued, people marching, demanding real change. Some believed in reform. Others doubted it would ever come. And Michael? He knew the truth. As he stepped out of the hearing, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. A single message appeared on the screen. This is just the beginning. Are you sure you want to keep going? Michael stared at the words. Then he smiled. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. The screen faded to black. A single line appeared. Based on true events, the fight continues. Justice isn't just about one victory. It's about the fight to make sure the truth is never buried again. Michael's story proves that standing up against corruption comes with a price. But silence costs even more. So, what would you do if the system turned against you? Would you walk away? Or would you fight back? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths for more real stories that challenge power. Expose corruption and demand justice. The fight isn't over, and neither are we.